Hello, hello. Welcome to all of our listeners back to the ETS Travel Podcast. I'm John, joined with Bethany here today.
Hi, guys.
And today we're going to be covering something very interesting, the spread of Celtic Christianity. From Ireland to Scotland, we're going to be covering this today. So, of course, this episode traces the movement of Celtic Christianity from Ireland into Scotland, exploring how faith took root, spread through monastic communities, and shaped the spiritual and cultural identity of both lands. So, we'll follow the journey and missionaries of saints and everyday believers whose influence is still felt today. So when we think of Celtic Christianity, it's easy to picture a distant, almost mythical past. But today, we're going to trace how faith emerged in Ireland and then also spread into Scotland, shaping both the land and people. So diving into this topic here, Bethany, what makes Celtic Christianity distinct from other expressions of the faith, would you say?
Sure. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, you had all these much more tribal people kind of slowly taking over the lands and, or they were kind of going more back to the tribal people if they had been taken over by Rome. And so before Rome fell, Christianity had been spreading through the Roman Empire slowly but surely and reaching all the way to places like Ireland and Scotland. But what's really unique about Celtic Christianity, and especially in those early days, is they had much more of a missionary aspect of trying to understand the local culture and adapt to it and use stories and settings already within the culture to kind of then as allegories for Christianity to kind of, convince them and help them to be more easily understood and things like that. Mm-hmm. Because they were reaching out to these tribes, it's much smaller communities. It's not like when Paul was going to the Ephesians and, it's this huge town. It was a big trading hub, these early saints going around Ireland and Scotland, they're going village by village and maybe there's 100 people there. So it's a much tighter community, not as inclined to talk to strangers and things like that. So it's a much, much different story than like what you see in Acts with Paul and things like these going to these big Greek and Roman cities.
Right.
And so as this developed and stuff, the leadership really took root in monasteries and abbots rather than having a bishop over a whole area and really centralized authority. They were a little more broken off and like in the wilderness and, building the community around these monasteries and abbeys that would, really support the community and do work within them. But, they're out there on their own. They could write letters off and that kind of stuff, but they might not hear back for months and things like these. So, they had a really strong theological appreciation for creation. A lot of the early saints we're going to talk about. So that's one of the amazing things. If you're going to Ireland and Scotland, it is some of the most beautiful scenery you're ever going to see.
Absolutely.
So, Ireland really became a kind of mission base, especially with the fall of the Roman Empire. So they would send out monks and missionaries who had to literally carry the gospel by foot, and then by boat beyond the shores, and especially spreading across Scotland, going down into England and continuing on.
Oh yeah, and like you said, it's beautiful and unique land. Like for those of you watching the podcast, our backdrop, you can see just all the cliffs and all the greenery. It's just beautiful. So and it's also fascinating to consider how a faith so rooted in culture could still have such a lasting global impact. So we'll dive a little bit into Ireland now, a land transformed. Ireland wasn't always Christian, and yet it became a place that not only received faith, but sent it out. Understanding that transformation is key to following the journey. So how would you say how did Ireland transition from a pagan society to a center of Christian faith? What role did St. Patrick play in that transformation?
Sure. Yeah, it's always really fascinating because when you think of Ireland today, or, even within the last 50 years of pop culture and things like that, the Irish are typically portrayed as Catholic and very, very, traditional Christian and things like these. But they definitely didn't start out that way. They were very much pagan, and they almost had to be conquered really, not necessarily through force, but really transformed with relationship and influence. So, missionaries like St. Patrick engaging directly, like we talked about a little bit before, with the tribal leaders, getting to know them and really work them towards conversion and understanding and acceptance of Christianity and things like this. So, St. Patrick, his methods were highly contextual. He understood their beliefs because he'd spent time, actually as a prisoner among them, and as a slave and things like that. So he really got to understand their beliefs, and he tried to use the familiar symbols, if you know the story of the clover and him using that as the example of the resurrection and things like that. So he made his message really accessible and meaningful. So that over time, as these young Christians in the tribes would go and interact with other people and, spread the gospel as well, he had made it easy enough for them to understand and taught them ways that they could explain it in a very simple way that would go cross-culturally between the tribes and things like that. So over time, Christianity did become very embedded in daily life, obviously affecting laws, educational systems, community structures. That's one of the fascinating things about monasteries and abbots. What a lot of them have become today is really just religious houses. But back in that time, lords and kings would send their kids off to be educated, because the most educated people were usually the monks who, were taught to read and write so that they could transcribe literature and the Bible and things like that and keep making copies, because there was no printing press yet. So this is long, long before we get to Gutenberg. And what's remarkable is that Ireland really was one of the far edges of the Roman world, and it became a center for Christian vitality as the Roman Empire fell. So, they really carried on Western civilization and helped continue its spread and bringing pagan tribes, teaching them to read and write and things like that and be more educated, as well as learn of the gospel and things like that. So this transformation really set the stage for Ireland to become a sending nation and not just a receiving one. So as we continue looking at Celtic Christianity, we'll dive into how they started to spread outside of Ireland.
Awesome. So yeah, it's it makes me wonder how much of our own surroundings shape the way we understand and practice our faith, for sure. And so our next segment that we'll cover here is the monasteries of Ireland, the engine of mission. So the monasteries of Ireland weren't just places to pray. They were engines driving the spread of Christianity. So we'll explore into why. And then I'll ask that question to you, Bethany. Why were monasteries so essential to the spread of Christianity in Ireland? What made places like Clonmacnoise.
Clonmacnoise.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I'm getting there. But what made places like Clonmacnoise so influential, would you say?
Sure. Monasteries definitely functioned as the heart of Irish Christianity. They weren't just places of prayer, but as I talked about before, they were centers of education. And, if you're the son of a young lord or a tribal leader or something from a large village, and you're going there to be educated because he wants you to be a good leader and those kind of things, you're spending all this time around the monks and seeing their deep spirituality. And, that will then shape that young person who has a future in leadership, and it's going to shape it. So through the spread of education specifically, it really starts to influence future leadership and laws and things like that, as well as they had effects on agriculture, the whole concept of hospitality. If anyone in need would go to one of the monasteries, they would be given food and they'd be given shelter. If they needed, tending to medically, the monks would do the best they could, with the knowledge they had at the time and things like that, because they were a mission. So, the monasteries served this function for the whole of the communities. And, within the monasteries, of course, the monks were trained in scripture and theology and practical skills, and that helped prepare them to go out and establish new communities. So, as well as training future leaders, the monks that they would train then became their missionaries. So Clonmacnoise in particular was strategically located at a crossroads of major travel for ancient Ireland at the time. So, it's not only natural hub for influence and interaction, but lots of people would pass it. It was convenient. It wasn't hard to get to, again, for people that were sending their children off to be students and things like that. And it also became a place where kings were buried. Scholars gathered to go through all the knowledge that the monks had, obtained and preserved there, and the spiritual life flourished. So it gave it a lot of political as well as religious significance. And these monastic communities, they preserved learning during a time when that was starting to fall off. So the Greeks and the Romans, they believed in educating a lot of the citizenry. If you were a citizen of Rome, typically you were taught how to read and write and things like these. As that fell away, and there's no longer this large governing body over most of Europe, a lot of people fall into ignorance. The idea of reading and writing becomes less important than just surviving. And so without these monastic communities and places like them, we wouldn't have the Western civilization we do today. It was their efforts of trying to educate the populace and help better them, that really, truly kind of saved what we think of as civilization now today. So, but most importantly, they really did cultivate a vision of outward, raising up missionaries, and they would go on to carry the faith far beyond Ireland.
Oh, for sure. And it's incredible to think how these isolated communities could influence the wider world so profoundly. So thank you for that. And then coming into our next segment here, spiritual authority and leadership. So we'll cover a little bit of that. So even a movement built on small communities needed centers of guidance and authority. Ireland had Armagh. Let's see why it mattered. So what role did key centers like Armagh play in shaping the Irish culture?
Yeah, so Armagh today is, a little bit north of Dublin. So even compared to modern times and kind of what the hub, the biggest city, in Ireland, Dublin is, Armagh is not far. And it really was recognized as a leading center of authority because of its association with St. Patrick in the early establishment as a major Christian site. And it's still a pilgrimage site for modern Catholics to go to as well and celebrate St. Patrick. So it helped provide a sense of unity and continuity across a network of otherwise independent monastic communities. So, they had this pilgrimage site. People would come here, they would do yearly gatherings and those kind of things, bring some of the different monastery communities together. And rather than enforcing strict control like a traditional bishop structure and things like that, Armagh functioned more as like a guiding influence, helping to shape the local doctrine, practice, helping appoint leadership for the monastic communities and the missionaries and things like that. So this balance found there really allowed Celtic Christianity to remain both structured, but be adaptable to their circumstances and where they were. So that's really a key factor in why Armagh was so important at the time. And it also reinforced the idea that leadership in the church was both spiritual and communal, not just institutional. It wasn't just, I've got to follow, what the governing body says. This is a community and it's really meant to help support me and things like that.
Right. And I find it fascinating that influence doesn't always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from an example and vision. So thank you for that. So next we're going to transition from Ireland into Scotland, where the movement begins. So From Ireland, the mission spread across the sea into Scotland. So, Bethany, how did that happen, and why was it successful?
Yeah, the movement into Scotland happened primarily through intentional missionary journeys by Irish monks, again, inspired by St. Patrick, who would have visited Scotland as well. And they felt called to take the gospel beyond their homeland. So, this whole generation of monks that had come to Christianity in Ireland and then been trained, they really wanted to spread it. Scotland wasn't that far. The Irish Sea wasn't a huge barrier. There are parts of it that are very close to Scotland, so it's almost a bridge with just a short little boat ride. And so coastal communities in Ireland and Western Scotland, they were already connected and trading, and there was migration between the two and things like that. So these missionaries would travel in small groups, often establishing new monastic communities all along the coast. And so even today, you can go and see some of the ancient abbeys and things like this that were built all along the western coast, especially because of the connection, and just that's where it first spread. Some of them later transitioned into stately homes, or became castles and things like that. But they started out as, building kind of the forward momentum for the missionaries. So they went across creating a network of faith across all these regions. Their approach was relational and immersive. So they had experienced it in Ireland. They saw that it worked. And so as they're moving into Scotland and a different people with a little bit different culture, they continued that because they realized, hey, if it worked here and it helped us save souls, let's do the same thing. Let's focus on community. Let's try to understand their culture and find ways to explain the gospel through their culture and their customs. So they continued to share the gospel in a way that made sense within the local cultures. And this outward focus really reflects a core principle that you'll find throughout studying Celtic Christianity. And so their approach was really relational and immersive. They lived among the people. They really tried to learn through their customs, just like they did within Ireland, and share the gospel in a way that made a lot more sense within the cultural context. And so, by really living in the community, doing the same kind of things they were doing with education, medicine, helping out with agriculture, all of this, and really trying to connect with the people, the outward focus they had really reflected a core principle we'll see as we continue talking about Celtic Christianity of, faith is not meant to stay contained. It's got to move and it's got to adapt.
Absolutely. And it's inspiring to think of faith as something active, not static, always moving toward new people and places, as we see here. So next we'll talk about Iona, a missional outpost. One of the most iconic sites of this mission is Iona. It may be small, but its influence is immense. Why is Iona so central to the story of Christianity in Scotland? Who was Columba also?
Yeah, so Saint Columba, and if you're reading or learning about Celtic Christianity, he's really going to come up quite a bit. But he was an Irish monk who left Ireland. It's traditionally understood as an act of exile or penance for getting in a little trouble. But he ended up establishing a monastery on the small island of Iona in the 6th century. So though geographically very remote, to this day, it's still a pain to get people to Iona. You have to go by ferry. There are only certain times of day and they're dependent on the weather. So yeah, it really hasn't gotten any easier to get to Iona. But it ended up becoming one of the most influential spiritual centers within the region. So from this small island, Columba and his community launched missionary efforts into mainland Scotland, and particularly whereas, around the western coast and kind of where Iona is, there had been a lot more intermingling with Ireland and things like this. It's you go further in, this is the Picts. This is very traditional Scottish people, very, very pagan, things like that. So Iona functions as both a place of deep spiritual formation and a sending base where missionaries were equipped and commissioned specifically to go and reach out into middle Scotland and further abroad. But it also became a place of pilgrimage later on, known for its worship, scholarship again, and preserving educational materials, Bible, scripture, things like that. And it always had a sense of a very sacred presence. To this day, people feel like it's a very kind of thin place between heaven and earth. So there are lots of groups that'll go and actually stay a few days and do retreats and things like that on Iona, partially because they feel that. And then also it is very remote. So, it's very easy to kind of cut yourself off from all the things of the world and really focus on spirituality and prayer and reflection and things like that. So we do have a lot of groups that'll travel with us and go there for that reason.
Oh, yeah. It's
but
nice.
The impact of Iona far exceeded its size. If you ever get the opportunity to see it today, you can go all the way around the island in a bus in 15 minutes. I mean, it's really not big, but it's become a beacon of Christianity for all of Scotland.
Yeah, no, super small. It's beautiful. And it reminds me that even in the smallest places, when consecrated to God's work, can have a global impact. So moving along here, we'll cover expanding more into Scotland now. So expanding across Scotland, once the gospel had a foothold on Iona, it began spreading into larger areas. Scotland became dotted with Christian centers. So how did Christianity spread beyond Iona? What roles did figures like Saint Mungo and Saint Ninian play in that?
Yeah, I love, as we talk about, these early Celtic priests and these kind of things and monks from the monasteries. They have such fun names. We have Saint Columba, we get to Saint Mungo, and then Saint Ninian. And there's still churches named after them. This is always funny to me. As the movement grew, new centers of Christianity emerged across Scotland, extending the influence, far beyond Iona. St. Mungo in particular, also known as Kintigern, played a key role in establishing Christianity in the region and especially around Glasgow. So if you go and visit Glasgow, there is still a very large cathedral dedicated to St. Mungo's that you can check out there. And so he spent time ministering specifically around the Glasgow area and then the River Clyde. St. Ninian, he's more associated with Whithorn, so where one of the earliest Christian sites in Scotland, Candida Casa, was established. These figures represent, kind of a continuation of that missionary pattern, establishing local centers that could sustain and spread the faith, again, focusing on, education and community outreach and things like that. So pilgrimage also became an important practice, with believers traveling to these sacred sites for worship, reflection, renewal. They still do to this day, especially to places like Iona. It's just, it books out a year in advance. It's probably the most popular of all the pilgrimage sites in Scotland. And, it's not specifically Catholic. We have Episcopalian groups, we have Lutheran groups, we have Methodist groups. They'll all go there because of the specialness of this place and the sense of getting away from everything and having a more spiritual connection and, reflecting, praying, things like this. So over time, Christianity really became woven into the fabric of Scottish identity, similar to how, like I talked about, the last 50 years of media, you think of Irish as being Catholic. You tend to also think of Scotland and Scottish people having some kind of faith in Christianity, as, it did split. They were heavily Catholic for a long time. Then they had the Anglican Church kind of forced on them. And then eventually the Presbyterian Church sprang out of Scotland as well with John Knox. So, from very, very early times, hundreds of years ago, it's been a very Christian country, and it's still thought of as such today, and a big part of, like I said, the fabric kind of Scottish identity.
Oh yeah. So it's amazing how faith can move beyond a single person or place and transform an entire nation. So we'll now jump into our next segment here. So faith and landscapes. So the landscapes of Ireland and Scotland are breathtaking. They're beautiful places. But they also shaped spiritual life. So we'll talk about that connection there. So how would you say, how did the landscapes of Ireland and Scotland shape spiritual life?
Sure. I mean, they definitely played a significant role in shaping how people experience God. Remote islands, rolling hills, very dramatic coastlines created natural spaces for reflection and prayer, places they could get away, things like that. And isolation wasn't seen as a hardship as much back in those times. It was often embraced as an opportunity to draw closer to God. And I think that's something we kind of lack to these days. Going off in a room alone to pray, there's still a lot of value in that. But, imagine living in Scotland and you could go, climb up Ben Nevis or something and really be alone and far from your village. And it's just you and God in this amazing landscape and things like that. I'm very, very jealous. Florida's pretty flat. So many monastic sites were also intentionally located in these remote areas for that purpose, reinforcing the idea of retreating away from society, putting the focus on the spiritual and things like that. And the natural world was viewed as a testimony to God's presence and creativity, which really influenced worship and theology. I mean, to this day, anytime I get to travel somewhere with a lot of natural beauty, the first thing that pops into my head is like, God's awesome. Because what human mind could have comprehended, and thought to create something like this. If you've ever gone through Alaska, or you've gone through like the Norwegian fjords and seen glaciers, if you've seen how just like green Ireland is, you go someplace like Glendalough in Ireland, and it's just, you've never seen those shades of green before. It's just so green. Or you go to the Cliffs of Moher, you're going around Loch Ness, or like I said, Ben Nevis or something like that, in Scotland. There's so much amazing natural beauty that you could hear it described to you and you would never be able to picture it. It's something you just have to see. So this connection between faith and place made pilgrimage deeply meaningful. And it wasn't just about the destination, journeying through these beautiful lands to get to the pilgrimage places and the monasteries and things like this, that's just helping reinforce God's amazing. I can't believe he created this. And we get to live here. I get to see this. I get to experience it and things like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I love, even a place like you brought up, like Alaska, not necessarily faith-based, but in the grand scheme, it kind of is, because God created this. And, same can be said about Ireland and any places of immense beauty like that. And it reminds me that sometimes God's work is seen as much in creation as in the people who walk through it. So we'll now cover our final segment of today, lasting legacy. So finally, let's reflect on the enduring impact of Celtic Christianity today. What would you say is the lasting impact of Celtic Christianity today?
Yeah, it definitely laid the foundational root for the development of Christianity throughout the British Isles. Influencing later traditions and movements. Like I talked about, you had the traditional Roman Catholic Church that, eventually the Anglican Church split off from it. People got upset at the Anglican Church and got upset at the Catholic Church. You had Presbyterians rise in kind of the south of Scotland. You obviously had the Methodist movement in England that would go then on to Ireland and Scotland and bring new ideas in the holiness movement and things like that. So, these early Celtic Christians and these monks, by bringing Christianity there, it would eventually flow and develop and adapt and reach different people in different ways with the creations of these different denominations. But all of them have always had a strong emphasis on, mission and community and spiritual discipline. And that continues to resonate throughout the different denominations that are now within Ireland and Scotland. And the monastic model, it's inspired contemporary approaches to intentional Christian community and discipleship. There's many different denominations that will have schools, and they seek to educate their congregants' children, in not just the subjects they need to know, like reading and writing and science and all of these wonderful things, but also about Christianity. Where did their faith come from? How to grow deeper in their faith and their relationship with Jesus Christ and things like that. So, you look back to those ancient monasteries and that's still continued, into the modern day. And pilgrimage still remains a powerful spiritual practice, drawing people to these historic sites for renewal and reflection. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the spread of the gospel often begins in small, faithful communities, willing to go beyond their borders. And we still experience that today. Many local churches here and many different denominations around the world, they all have missionaries. They have people that are still leaving their home and their safety and their communities to go and spread the gospel to this day. So, it started with Paul and the apostles back in the time of the book of Acts, and the Celtic Christians, they continued that missionary tradition, and then we still do it today. And so one final thing I'll kind of leave you guys with, if you're curious to go more in depth in learning about Celtic Christianity and the spread after the fall of the Roman Empire, I highly recommend, I read this book about probably 10, 12 years ago now, How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill. I highly recommend it if you found this fascinating. He does a much better job than me of making it sound really exciting and setting it in the form, almost, it feels like you're reading a story instead of like a historical thesis on, how Christianity spread and things like that. But I highly recommend it. It's a really, really good read.
Awesome. I'll have to pick that up. And it's it's humbling to think that the seeds planted centuries ago can still be bearing fruit today. With the great mission history there and how that still impacts us today. So we'll wrap it up here very shortly. But for those who might walk this journey from Ireland and Scotland themselves, there's more here than history. So the last thing we'll cover here, Bethany, what makes this journey more than just a historical tour?
Sure. You're stepping into a living story. You're not just going to observe history from a distance. As we've talked about with pilgrimage and things like that before, you're walking in the footsteps of Christians from hundreds of years before you, and you're connecting to this continuous faith and this whole history and this deeper spiritual connection you have with Christians that came before you. So travelers following in the footsteps of missionaries who carry their faith across different cultures and landscapes, the experience is going to connect intellectual understanding with physical presence. So, you're physically being there while hearing all these stories from your tour guide and things like that. It's seeing and walking and reflecting in the very places where history actually unfolded. So it also invites personal reflection on one's own faith journey and what it means to live it out today. But ultimately, it becomes less about the destinations and more about the transformation along the way. If you haven't listened to it already, we cover a lot of this in our last episode about pilgrimage and why it's still so important and what kind of transformations you can do. But going through, for me in particular, Ireland and Scotland, it would be seeing the natural beauty, because just anytime I'm in places like that and just surrounded by natural beauty, like I said, I have that instant God is awesome. Like, he created all of this, and just the most beautiful painter you could imagine.
Oh, yeah. That's incredible. It's incredible to see. And I love that the journey isn't just about the places, but how it shapes us along the way. So for those that may have clients interested in Ireland, or those that might just be interested in general, we have two itineraries. So the Treasures of Ireland and also the Celtic Christianity in Scotland. So for those that are interested in both of these are great ways to see the locations that we spoke about and learn more about the people that we've talked about on this episode. So another cool thing too is our Scotland itinerary offers a optional post tour to Ireland, so you're able to experience both in one. So thank you, Bethany, for sharing with us and outlining us the importance and what Celtic Christianity in Ireland and Scotland really is. I know it's a question we get a lot, is the growing popularity of touring over there in the faith-based aspects. So as always, we appreciate you going over what makes it special, both of these locations. And for all of our listeners, we appreciate you for tuning in. Be sure to follow us, subscribe to the podcast, give us a like, send us your comments, any suggestions on future episodes. We definitely appreciate your feedback. And in the meantime, whatever day you're listening to this, hope you have a blessed one. And thank you for always tuning in.
Yeah, we'll see you guys later.